Rejected 13 times for her stutter. A silent sheriff married her without a word spoken. The ring was too big. I knew it when I slid it on her finger in the cold of the vestibule, the reverend waiting on the other side of that door, snow still on my boots from the walk over. Too big. My wife, my first wife, she'd had smaller hands. I'd held onto the ring a long time. 9 years, give or take. Kept it in the front pocket of my vest, where I used to keep my father's watch before I lost that at cards in Abilene. The ring rode there, in that little pocket, pressing against my ribs on the left side when I lay down at night, and I told myself I kept it there to remember her. But the truth was I didn't know what else to do with a thing that used to mean everything. Nora held the ring on with her thumb, and she looked up at me, and the thing she did with her eyes, not a smile, not exactly, something smaller, made me look at the door so she wouldn't see whatever was happening in my face. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's the trouble with trying to tell it. You think you'll start at the start and your mind goes to that vestibule, that ring, that look, and you've got to haul yourself back. Virgil Cord, that's my name. Sheriff of Callaway County since 1871, which was 11 years before Nora Marsh arrived on the stage from Topeka. I was 43 when she came. Not old, but I felt it some mornings. My knee mostly. Old break from a fall off a horse in '68, never set quite right. I was a quiet man. People in town had different ways of saying it. Some said steady, some said cold. Young Tom Ahern, who worked the livery, told anyone who'd listen that I was hard as a fence post and about as friendly. I didn't mind it much. You spend enough years being the man people call when something's gone wrong, you learn to hold yourself a certain way. You learn the uses of quiet. The town of Callaway was not large. 3 streets proper, a few that spread out along the creek. We had a general store, a mill, 2 saloons, a church that doubled as the schoolhouse before we built the proper one, a doctor's office with a barber chair in the front half. We had a hotel, the Galloway House, named for the man who built it, not the town, though people got them confused. And it was at the Galloway House that Emmett Pickett kept a table where he interviewed prospective wives. I have to tell you about Emmett Pickett. Emmett was not a bad man, I want to be fair. He had 300 acres south of town, good land, creek-fed, and he ran a clean operation. His first wife had died of fever 6 years before, and he'd raised his 2 sons mostly alone since then, with help from a Mexican woman named Agustina who did the cooking and the washing and who, it seemed to me, did most of the raising as well. Emmett was lonely, and that I understood. But Emmett was also a man who talked about himself the way you'd talk about something in a shop window, as if the value was self-evident and required only that the other party look long enough to appreciate it. He'd sent away twice for wives, and both women had come out and looked at him and gone back east before the week was out. After that, he'd started the practice of the table at the Galloway House, which was his way of saying, "Come to me." He'd set up on a Saturday and the women of the county, or women passing through, or women come specifically, could sit across the table and talk with him and he'd decide. It was a peculiar arrangement. But it was legal, and Emmett was one of the larger landowners in the county, and people in Callaway had a way of treating the peculiarities of large landowners as simply the customs of the land. Nora Marsh came in on the October stage. I was at the depot when the stage came in. I was usually there. It was part of how I kept a sense of what was moving through the county, and I watched her step down. She had a carpetbag and a hat that had seen better days and a look about her like she was counting the buildings and finding the number acceptable. She was maybe 30, 32. Dark eyes. A particular way of holding her chin level, like she'd decided something about it once and held to it. She went to the Galloway House. I didn't think much more about her until 4 days later, when Emmett Pickett came into my office. He sat down across from my desk. I hadn't offered him the chair, but Emmett Pickett sat wherever he liked, and he put his hat on his knee and he said, "Cord, I need you to know about a situation." I looked at him. "The woman from Topeka," he said. "Marsh. She's been sitting at the Galloway table. I waited. He stopped, made a sound with his lips. She has a stutter, a bad one. Took her near 3 minutes to tell me her name. I can't have that, Cord. A man in my position. At church, at the mill, at supper with business associates. Can you imagine? I could imagine Nora Marsh sitting across from Emmett Pickett, and the 3 minutes it took her to get her name out, and Emmett's face during those 3 minutes. I'm telling you because, he said, there may be other men who try their luck with her, and I want it understood she's been looked over and found wanting. By me. I want that known. You want me to spread word, I said. I want it understood, he said again, like there was a difference. I told him I hadn't much to say about who sat at whose table. He put his hat back on and left. I thought about it the rest of the day. The way he'd said found wanting, like she was a piece of timber he'd tested with his boot and found soft. I saw her the next morning at the store. She was buying flour and she was asking Amos Garrett about the grade of it, whether it was fresh milled, and Amos was watching her the way you watch something you're not sure of, patient on the outside and irritated underneath. She got the question out. Amos told her it was fresh enough. She paid and picked up her flour and turned, and our eyes met for about 1 second, and she gave me a small nod, not deferential, just the nod you'd give a person who happens to be in the same room, and she walked out. I bought what I came for and walked back to my office, and I don't know exactly what I was thinking. Mostly nothing. I had 2 disputes to settle that afternoon, a question about a property boundary, and a drunk in my second cell who needed to be pointed toward the stage. Over the next few weeks I heard about the table. Well, Norbert had sat across from her and come away shaking his head. Phil Caston, who was a good man but not a patient one, had done the same. Albert Schur, who owned the feed operation near the mill, had apparently walked out before she finished her first sentence. The barber's cousin who'd come to visit and been looking for a wife tried his luck and lasted, according to Lucy Ahern at the post office, who heard everything, approximately 4 minutes. Then there was the school teacher who'd come out from Wichita on a rumor she might suit him, and the rancher named Duffy from the north side of the county, and 2 or 3 others I didn't know personally. 13 was the number I heard at some point, 13 men. Most of them not bad men, just men who'd sat across a table and weighed what they thought they'd be looking at for the rest of their lives and decided it wasn't for them. What I thought about, when I let myself think about it, what I couldn't quite shake, was the patience it must have taken to keep sitting down at that table, to look at one more man's face. There was a fire in early November. The Harris barn on the east side of the county caught from an overturned lantern, and we lost a good part of the structure before it came down. Nobody was hurt. I spent 2 days out there helping organize the effort, and then another day settling a question about whether the Dunlap brothers, who had a grudge against Cal Harris going back 3 years, had anything to do with it. They didn't. It was just a fire. That's the truth of most things. They're just the thing they are, and nobody caused them. You look for a hand behind every bad thing when really most of it is just weather and error and time. When I got back to town, Nora Marsh was still at the Galloway house. I don't know why I'd thought she might be gone. Maybe because most people in her position would have given up and gotten back on a stage. But she was there, and she was, I found out later, though not much later, running low on money. She'd come with enough for a month's room and board, and the month was nearly up. It was Ruth Galloway who told me. Ruth ran the hotel with her husband, and she was a practical woman who did not gossip lightly. But she came into my office on a Tuesday morning and said, "Cord, I don't know what you're going to do about this, but that woman Marsh is going to have to leave by Friday, and she's got nowhere to go, and I don't think she knows it yet." I asked her what she meant. "I mean," said Ruth, "she's been sitting at that table and nobody's taken her, and she paid for 4 weeks, and the 4 weeks are up Friday. And she came here to find a husband, and she hasn't found one, and I can't keep feeding her on credit, Cord. I'm not a charity house." I thanked her and she left. I sat at my desk for a while. Outside the window, the main street had the particular look it gets in November. The light thin and sideways, the dusk gone and the mud not yet here, just a dry gray that makes everything look a little used up. I thought about what I was going to do. Then I got up, put on my coat and hat and walked to the Galloway house. She was in the small room off the dining room, the one Ruth called the reading room, though there were only 3 books in it. She had a cup of tea on the table and was looking out the window at the street. When I came in, she looked up, no surprise or not much, level like the way she'd held her chin at the depot. I took off my hat. I said, "Miss Marsh, my name's Cord, Virgil Cord, I'm the sheriff here." She waited. I said, "I'll get right to it. I'm a widower, have been 9 years. I live on the north side of town. It's a decent house with a wood stove and a good well. I've got a steady income, not a rancher's income, but steady. I'm not looking for anything beyond a partner, a companion, someone to build a life with." She was watching me, not cautiously, directly. "I'm not asking because I feel sorry for you," I said. I don't know exactly why I said that, except that it was true and I wanted her to know it was true. I watched what happened here for a month and I thought about it, and I don't believe a woman with the patience you've shown sitting down at that table with man after man is a woman who's wanting. I think it's the men who were wanting. And I think you deserve to hear that from somebody. Something moved across her face. Quick, she looked at her tea. I said, "I'm not asking you to say yes right now. I'm asking if you'll sit with me a while and let me tell you what I am, and then you can decide." She looked up again, and then she said, and it came slow, it came in pieces, but it came clear, "All right." We sat in that room for 2 hours. I did most of the talking, which is not how I usually am. I told her about me, and about the years after me, and about the county and how I ran it and what I liked about it. I told her about my knee and the horse in Abilene. I told her about my father, who had been a quiet man too, who could go 3 days on a cattle drive without saying more than 20 words, and still be the man everyone looked to when something needed deciding. She told me in pieces, slowly, with long pauses I didn't try to fill, that she was from a farm family in Indiana originally, that she'd come to Topeka with a cousin who'd since moved on, that she'd worked in a millinery shop for 4 years, that she'd been spoken to kindly and unkindly about her stutter her whole life, and that the unkindness she'd built up a skin against, and the kindness sometimes she couldn't tell from pity. I said I supposed the difference was whether the kind person needed her to respond to it. She looked at me like she was deciding something. Then she nodded once slowly, like she'd added that to a list she was keeping. She asked me, and this came out with a particularly long pause in the middle, but she held on and got through it, whether I was a patient man. I thought about it seriously before I answered. I said I wasn't sure that's how I'd put it. I said I was a man who understood that some things took the time they took, and that I didn't consider that patience so much as sense. She looked out the window for a moment, then she looked back at me. "WW," she started, stopped, took a breath, started again differently. "When would you want to pause, Mary?" I said that was up to her. She said Friday. I asked if that was because of the room. She said yes, partly. And partly she'd sat at that table 13 times, and she knew her own mind now. I stood up and we shook hands, which was a peculiar thing to do under the circumstances, but it felt right, and I put my hat on and went back to my office to finish out the day. I want to tell you about Thursday night, because I think it says something. I sat at my kitchen table, just the one oil lamp, the stove going, the sound of the wind off the plain that I'd lived with so long I'd stopped hearing it except on nights when I thought too hard, and I took the ring out of the watch pocket and put it on the table and looked at it. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, some feeling about me, I suppose. Some question about whether this was right, or whether I was making a fool of myself, or whether a woman who'd looked at 13 men had looked at me too, and just found me convenient. What I came to sitting there was this: me was gone. She'd been gone 9 years, and I'd buried her, and I'd done everything a man does when he buries someone, gone through the grief of it, the hollowing out, the getting used to the absence, the particular silence of a house that used to have another person in it. I'd done all that, and what I was left with wasn't emptiness anymore. It was just quiet. A particular quiet that's not painful exactly, but that after a while isn't quite right either. Nora Marsh had sat across from 13 men who looked at her and decided she wasn't worth their patience. And she'd sat there again. That said something. Not just about her stubbornness, though she had it, you could see it in the set of that chin, but about what she believed about herself underneath. She believed she was worth the wait. She was right. I put the ring back in my pocket, went to bed, got up at 5 like I always did, fed the horse, built the kitchen fire, made coffee. I walked to the church through the snow. Reverend Stills was a nervous man in general, and a more nervous man when required to do anything on short notice. And I think the combination of the 2 days' notice and the particular quality of silence with which I delivered the request gave him the impression that something was irregular. He kept asking me leading questions. Was the young woman sure? Was she settled in her thinking? Had there been some kind of arrangement previously? And I kept answering in ways that were truthful but not extensive, until he ran out of questions and agreed to do it at 2 o'clock Friday. Ruth Galloway stood up for Nora. I had Tom Ahern, the livery boy who'd said I was hard as a fence post, because Tom had come to me 3 months earlier when he needed $30 to keep his mother from losing her house, and I'd given it to him. And after that he'd had a different opinion of me, and also a debt of gratitude that I now collected. He stood there in his good coat looking like he wasn't entirely sure how he'd ended up in a church on a Friday afternoon, but was committed to seeing it through. Nora came in wearing a dark blue dress I hadn't seen before. I later found out Ruth had lent it to her, which was the most generous thing I'd ever seen Ruth Galloway do. And she walked to where I was standing at the front of the church, and she looked at me the same way she had in the reading room, straight on, deciding. The Reverend started in. I listened to the words, and they weren't strange to me. I'd said them once before, 22 years ago, in a church in Kansas City, with me's father watching me like I was something he hadn't made up his mind about, but they had a different weight this time. Not worse. Different. When it came to the part of the service where I was to speak my part, I did. When it came to her part, and Stills had lowered his voice slightly at that point, with the delicacy of a man who'd been warned, she held still for a moment, and I heard Tom Ahern shift his feet. And then she said, quietly but clearly, the words she needed to say, and they came out unbroken, steady as I've ever heard anything said. I put the ring on her finger, too big. She held it with her thumb. We went out into the snow. The first weeks were careful. That's the honest word for it. We were 2 adults who had made a decision with our heads and were now learning whether anything else would follow. I gave her the larger bedroom and took the smaller one. I showed her where I kept things in the kitchen, and she rearranged half of it within the first week, which I didn't mind. She was a good cook, better than me, which wasn't a high standard. She made a bean soup that third night that was the best thing I'd eaten in a year at least, and I told her so, and she looked pleased in the careful way she looked most things, pleased but not surprised by it, as if she'd known the soup was good and was glad I'd noticed. She didn't talk much in the evenings. Neither did I. We sat on opposite sides of the parlor, she with her mending or a book, me with whatever paperwork had followed me home, and the fire went and the wind went, and neither of us seemed to find the quiet uncomfortable. That was the first thing I noticed that felt like something more than arrangement. The quiet between 2 people who are uneasy is a different thing from the quiet between 2 people who aren't. I'd lived with the first kind for 9 years. I recognized it from the outside now. There was a night in December, maybe 3 weeks in, when I came home late from a long ride out to the Caldwell spread dispute over a missing horse that turned out to be on the wrong side of a fence and alive and well. And it was well past 9, and I was cold to the bone, and the road had been bad. I came in and she'd left a lamp burning in the kitchen, and there was a plate under a cloth on the stove, kept warm. I sat down and ate it, and somewhere in the middle of it, I had a feeling I hadn't had in a long time, a feeling so simple it almost didn't register. Someone had thought about when I'd be hungry. I sat there a while after the plate was empty. The lamp made a small sound, the wick breathing. I thought about me briefly, the way I always did when something reminded me of what a house could feel like, and then I thought about Nora upstairs asleep, and the two thoughts didn't conflict the way I'd expected. They just sat next to each other. I washed the plate, went upstairs, stopped at her door which was closed. I didn't knock, but I stood there a second. Then I went to my room. I want to tell you about what happened in January, because it's the part of the story that I think shaped everything after. Emmett Pickett came into my office on a morning after a night of hard snow. He had the look of a man who'd been turning something over for a while and had finally decided to say it. He sat down again without being offered the chair and said, "I understand you married the Marsh woman." "I did," I said. "I want you to know," he said, "I don't think less of you for it. A man gets lonely and she was available and—" "Emmett," I said. He stopped. I don't raise my voice. I never have, not really. It's just not how I'm put together. But there are certain ways I can say a single word that communicate a thing more completely than a raised voice would. Emmett had lived in Callaway County long enough to know this. "She's my wife," I said, "and she's a fine woman. And if I hear you say something like that again, or hear that you've said something like it to someone else, I'm going to have a different kind of conversation with you." Emmett looked at his hat. "I didn't mean any disrespect," he said, which wasn't exactly an apology but was as close as Emmett Pickett got. "I know you didn't," I said. "Go home, Emmett." He went. I sat at my desk and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing having been said cleanly. A man who'd spent his life being quiet learns which words, said at the right moment, carry everything that needs to be carried. That evening I told Nora about it. Not the whole conversation, but that Pickett had come in and I'd sent him away. I don't know why I told her. I don't usually recount my workday. She was at the table, writing a letter. She had 2 sisters in Indiana she wrote to regularly, and she stopped and looked at me. I said I thought she should know that if anyone in this county treated her with anything less than they'd treat any other wife in this county, I expected to hear about it, and I'd handle it. She looked at me for a long time, long enough that I thought maybe I'd said something wrong or too much. I wasn't used to saying that much. Then she set down her pen and she said, carefully, one word at a time, each one clear, "Nobody has ever said that to me." I didn't say anything back. I nodded. I went and hung up my coat. That night I heard her laughing at something. She was still at the table when I went to bed, and she must have thought of something in her letter, or something her sister had written back, a quiet laugh, just to herself. I lay in my room and listened to it and felt the quiet in the house change. Spring came. We'd settled into each other by then in the way that 2 people will when they're both practical and neither is difficult. There were things I'd started doing without thinking about them. Putting water on for her tea before I made my coffee, leaving my boots by the door because she didn't like the mud tracked in, walking a little slower coming up the stairs after 10 so I didn't wake her. Small things. The kind that aren't decisions, just the adjustments a person makes when another person matters. She'd started doing things too, things I noticed. She knew when I'd had a hard week. I don't know how I didn't say it, and on those weeks she made the bean soup again or the corn cake I'd mentioned liking once in passing, and apparently she'd remembered. She left me alone when I was thinking, which was one of the things I valued most in another person. She had opinions on the town, on the county, on things she read, and she gave them plainly when I asked and sometimes when I didn't. She was honest without being hard about it. One afternoon in April, I came in to find her trying to move a bureau from one wall to another. One of those decisions women make about furniture that seem to arrive without warning. And she'd got it halfway and it was stuck, and she was standing there looking at it with a particular expression I'd come to recognize as her version of stubbornness that hadn't won yet. I moved it for her, and then she directed me about 2 inches to the left and 2 inches forward, and then she walked around it and stood with her hands on her hips and looked at where it now sat, and something about the looking made me smile. She caught it, she said D, and then because the word started wrong she started differently. It looks better. It does, I agreed. She looked at me and I looked at her, and there was something in the air of that room that afternoon I hadn't felt since before me got sick. Not the same as that, not identical, but related, like hearing a tune you know played on a different instrument. I went back to what I'd been doing. That night, for the first time, I left my door open. I don't know if she noticed. She didn't say anything. But in the morning she left my coffee on the stove instead of the counter, which meant she'd heard me come down, which meant she'd been awake. I drank the coffee. Outside the window the plains had that April look they get, the grass coming back, the sky wider than it has any right to be. I stood there a while before I went to work. There was a man who came through in May, passing through on his way to Denver, who stopped at the Galloway house for 2 nights. His name was Carr, a land speculator, the kind of man who was always in motion and always talking about where he was going to be next. On his second evening in town, he came into the saloon where I sometimes had a glass in the evening, and he sat down uninvited at my table and talked about his business for a while, which I let him do because it wasn't my business to stop a man from talking. And then he got to the part where he'd heard things around town, and he said, with the kind of frankness that men who are always moving think they can afford, "I heard you married that woman, the one who can't get a word out." I put my glass down. He said, "No offense to you, but what's the point of a wife you can't?" "Carr," I said. He stopped. I said, "You're passing through, you'll be gone in the morning, so I'll say this once and I won't say it in a way that requires you to respond. My wife says what she has to say. She says it clearly when she gets to it. I've learned more from listening to her than I've learned from most men I've known, and I've known a lot of men, you included, as of tonight." I picked up my glass again. "Have a good trip to Denver." He left. I sat and finished my drink. The next morning he was gone. Virgil Cord, the barkeep, had heard enough of it to tell someone, who told someone else, and by the end of the week the version that had gotten around was somewhat larger than what actually happened, as these things always get. But the substance was right. I didn't tell Nora about it. There was no reason to bring it to her. It was done. In June she had a letter from her sister Clara, and whatever was in it put a shadow on her that lasted 3 days. She didn't say what it was. I didn't ask. On the 3rd evening she was sitting out on the porch after supper, and I came and sat beside her, and we watched the field and the sky and said nothing for a long time, and then she said, My father is sick." I said I was sorry to hear it. She said he wasn't breath. He wasn't a man who pause. He was ashamed of how she stopped, started again. He never let me talk in company, he'd speak for me. I sat with that. She said I kept thinking he'd pause, that he'd say something different, before. She stopped, didn't start again. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I said, "A man can be wrong about his own child for a long time and still come around." She didn't answer. I said, "And if he doesn't, he's the one who missed something." She was quiet. Then she leaned her shoulder against mine, just lightly, just for a moment, and then she straightened and looked at the field. We sat there until it was dark enough that the fireflies came out over the grass. Neither of us said anything else. We didn't need to. The ring stopped being too big in August. I don't mean it shrank. What I mean is I stopped noticing it. Somewhere over the spring and summer, the ring had become part of how her hand looked to me, the gold band and her thumb beside it, and I stopped seeing the fit and just saw her hand. I don't know exactly when I understood what she was to me. I think it came in pieces, and I wasn't paying close enough attention to catch the moment. I'd catch up to it later. I'd be out on a long ride checking the far fences or sitting through a dull council meeting about road taxes, and I'd have a thought about the fireflies or the bureau or the bean soup or her voice saying nobody has ever said that to me, and I'd realize the thought had been there a while, waiting. She'd become the person I wanted to tell things to. That's the simplest way I know how to put it. Not just the hard things or the things that needed deciding. The ordinary things. The horse with the grass in her teeth, the kid at the livery who tried to overcharge a stranger, the way the light came through the courthouse window in late afternoon. Things a man notices and then, if there's nobody to tell them to, forgets. With Nora, I didn't forget them. I carried them home. It was a night in September that I remember most clearly. She'd gone to bed early with a headache, and I'd sat up later than usual, not reading, just sitting with the lamp down and the window open. The September air had a bite in it at night now, the summer going. I sat there and thought about the year that had passed, and it was the first time I'd done that kind of accounting in a long time, not a regret account, not the kind where you tally losses, but the other kind. The kind where you see what you have. I went up to bed. Her door was open. She'd started leaving it open sometime in the summer. I wasn't sure when, and the room was dark except for the moonlight through the curtains. I stopped at the door. She was asleep, her shoulder visible, her hair loose. The ring was on the table by the lamp where she put it at night because it was too big to sleep in. I stood there a while, long enough to feel something settle in my chest, something that had been loose since me, finally settling. Then I went to my room. In the morning the coffee was on the stove. I came down and she was already at the table with her letters, and she looked up when I came in and said, "Good morning," the way she always did, and I said good morning back, and she looked at my face for a second in that direct way she had, and then she said, "Sleep well." I said I did. She said, "You stood in my doorway last night." I said I thought she was asleep. She said I was, pause, small smile, but I heard you. I poured my coffee. I stood at the window looking out at the street, the horse traffic starting up, the lights still low and long across the rooftops. She went back to her letters. After a while I said, without turning from the window, "Nora." She waited. I said, "I want you to know I came to that table for myself, not for any other reason, because I thought you were a woman worth sitting with, and I was right." She didn't answer right away. I heard her set down her pen. Then she said, "Virgil." I turned. She was looking at me from across the room, the letters on the table between us and the morning light through the window on the side of her face, and what was in her eyes was not soft, exactly, and it wasn't sentiment. It was something closer to what you feel when you've been walking a long way in difficult country and you reach a place you recognize. Not relief, though there was some of that. Something better. Something that says, "I was right to keep coming." She said slowly, one word at a time, and each word came clear. "I know why you came. I knew then." "Did you?" I said. "You were the only man who didn't look at the clock." I didn't have anything to say to that. I turned back to the window. After a minute she picked up her pen. We stayed like that, her writing and me standing at the window with my coffee, until the street got loud enough that I needed to go to work. I put on my hat and coat and I stopped at the door and looked back at her. She was bent over her letter, writing, the morning light on her hair. I said, "I'll be late tonight. Fence dispute out east." She said without looking up, "I'll leave the plate." I opened the door. The morning came in cold and clear. I walked down to the office feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. The streets were the same. The courthouse was the same. Tom Ahern was pulling the livery doors open the same way he did every morning. Nothing was different. Everything was different. I hung my hat on the hook inside the door. I sat down at my desk. I picked up the first paper from the pile. The ring was on her finger, still too big, held there by her thumb. And from across town, in a quiet house with a wood stove and a good well, a woman with 2 letters to write and a plate to leave warm on the stove was doing what she had always done, moving through her day, her way, at her own pace, without apology. That was mine to come home to. A man understands what he has when he understands what it costs the other person to give it. Nora Marsh had sat at 13 tables and gotten back up after each one, and then she had sat at mine and stayed. That's not a small thing. That's not a convenient thing or a lesser thing because 13 other men didn't see it. That's the best thing. I worked until noon and then I walked home to eat lunch, something I hadn't done in years. She looked up when I came in and didn't ask why, just put another plate on the table. We ate. The wind came off the plane and the stove worked, and the light came through the window at the particular angle it only gets in September, the year running down to something quiet. I didn't need to say anything else. Neither did she.